The Combahee River Raid is a little-known battle during the Civil War, but its impact was significant. Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Edda Fields-Black about Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black freedom during the Civil War. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. In addition to being an author, Edda Fields-Black teaches history at Carnegie Mellon University. She's been a consultant at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the International African American Museum, and the Senator John Heinz History Center. She joins us to talk about Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black freedom during the Civil War. Edda, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
A point of curiosity, I know that you've written a book about West African rice, and you've researched that rice. But how did that all lead to writing about this raid?
Yes. So I, before Combee, have written about peasant farmers in West Africa, as well as Blacks who were enslaved on rice plantations. I was engaged in what I will call my passion project, Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice. And I was writing the libretto for what became a symphonic work. And looking for dramatic scenes. I was going through primary sources, many of which I had used before in academic writing. Some of them were new, looking for dramatic scenes where I could convey emotion, through which I could convey emotion. And I ran across Minus Hamilton's life story. And I write about Minus Hamilton. He has a chapter in Combee, and I track him from, 1839, I believe, until his death in Combee. And I was fascinated by this, he said, 88-year-old man talking about the raid and his experiences, his wife's experiences in the raid, and speaking in a first-person account. So that stayed with me. I was working on a second book, which I thought was going to be a history of the Gullah Geechee. And I had written 2 Civil War chapters, which were entirely too long. And Minus Hamilton's story, once again, was central to those chapters. And these 2 separate projects started growing in opposite directions, and I needed to bring them into closer alignment. And it was the raid that fascinated me. It was the raid that connected both of them, and the raid that took place on 7 rice plantations. And so that's where I decided, that was the beginning of me deciding to write this story.
Now, this is a substantial book, exhaustively researched, and we're not going to have time to talk about everything in it. So before we talk about a few specifics, give us a quick overview here. What are readers going to find?
Well, let's start here with Harriet Tubman, who comes down to Beaufort, South Carolina in late May 25th of 1862. She is sent down by Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts to be a spy for the U.S. Army Department of the South. And Tubman works primarily in refugee camps in downtown Beaufort. She has a group of men, 8 or 9 men, who are all spy scouts and pilots, and she's the leader of this group. And on June 1st, 1863, Tubman and her group of spy scouts and pilots pilot Colonel James Montgomery, who was the commander of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, with the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. And I should say Montgomery, of course, is from Kansas. So we have a connection there. And one company of the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery up the Combee River Raid. Up the Combee River. So the goal of the raid was to destroy a pontoon bridge over the Combee at Combee Ferry, to cut the Confederate supply lines, to destroy one of the Confederacy's bread baskets. So on these rice plantations, the rice that was produced helped to feed the Confederate Army and Confederate citizens, and it was still being traded abroad. and to fill the regiment, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. They succeeded by all accounts, did not lose a single life, and 756 enslaved people liberated themselves. And I argue it was the largest and most successful slave rebellion in U.S. history.
The river is kind of has a starring role in your book, in part because of the rice plantations, but also because it's the whole scene of what happens here. And you got hands-on, or should I say feet-on experience with the river and the rice plantations. Tell us about that research and why understanding the river is pivotal to telling the story.
So I was very fortunate to have a partnership with Nemours Wildlife Foundation, which is a private foundation made up of multiple former rice plantations, and it's located on the Combee River. And I spent about 18 months in residence back and forth at Nemours. We did a number of things. I had a lot to learn about the river. I'm not a boater. I wanted to be able to put the reader on the river during the raid. So on the one hand, the book was about, the families, the slaveholding families, the enslaved families who were living and working on the river. On the other hand, it was very much about the river itself, the environment of these coastal wetlands and these rice fields. So we did several reenactments. The scientists and I, scientists from Nemours and other friends of mine who are scientists and working in the area. And these were guys who grew up on the river, sailing on the river. We tried to reenact different aspects of the raid. So the raid takes place under a full moon, and they leave downtown Beaufort around 9 p.m. in June. So it would have been dark by that time, but just, getting dark because it gets dark later. So we went up the river at night with no lights, no gadgets, traveling about 6 to 7 miles per hour. As the boats would have traveled during the raid, and tried to really understand how the pilots piloted the river at night under the full moon. We went up a second time. I went up with another group of friends a second time and tried to recreate the exact route. And so 3 boats left downtown Beaufort. 1 boat ran aground at the mouth of the Coosaw River. And when we went up during the day using all of the gadgets, we also ran aground at the mouth of the Coosaw River. And that was not planned. It just happened. The Coosaw is pretty challenging, and I argue in the book that one of Tubman's spy scouts and pilots who was born on the Coosaw, was a boatman in Beaufort, might have influenced this decision to take a shortcut up the Coosaw River as opposed to going around to save time. And the third reenactment we did, one of the boats pulls into a creek in the rice fields and pulls up to one of the planters' front door. It arrives at his boat landing. And I suggest that, how do you know where these creeks are in the rice fields? They knew it because some of these men had been enslaved on these rice plantations, and they knew this river very, very well. So we had to go up the creek. Did not get stuck, but it was close.
And as I mentioned, you literally got your feet wet. You wanted to get the feel of what it was like to maybe have worked in that river or, been part of that raid and going through the river in your bare feet.
Yes, with my scientist friends. Another reenactment we did was to walk barefoot through the rice fields. And, I've worked in rice fields in West Africa as well as in South Carolina for 25 years. I had never been barefoot. I always wore boots. So I was a little bit apprehensive about this. But I was I learned a lot. I had all these theories about how the raid happened, and most of them were wrong. So this particular theory was that the enslaved people ran through the rice fields when they heard the gunboats and they got on the boat. And first we walked through the rice fields and I could feel how slippery and prickly they were. Then a baby alligator decided to join us. And I knew, I'm not an expert, and I should say the scientists I was with, some of them study alligators, fish, snakes. They study the entire ecosystem, so they knew a lot more than I did. But I knew that if the baby was there, the mother alligator was not far behind. So this is when I took off trying to run through the rice fields and found that my theory was completely impractical and got to the edge. There are these earthen embankments around the rice field that are called dikes. The tallest ones hold the river back from the rice fields. And then within the field, there are some that are shorter in height that kind of divide the rice fields. So I got to the edge of the main dike and tried to climb up. And actually, one of the scientists had to pull me out because it was such a step up to get onto that embankment. So what that taught me is that the enslaved people probably went to the lower dikes that are the dividers, get out there, run across, and then, out to the river on the main dike. That would be much more practical than trying to run through the rice fields.
I'm talking with Edda Fields-Black about Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black freedom during the Civil War. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you're getting value out of this discussion, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you'll be notified when I post new interviews with authors. And thank you. And as you mentioned, you encountered a baby alligator. There were also snakes in the area, which I'm sure added a little bit of extra anxiety to being in the fields. And that reminds me also that the book also has a fairly substantial section of photographs. And what made me think about that is because you have pictures of snakes and a baby alligator in there. Tell us a little bit more about that collection of photographs and what you wanted to show in that section of the book.
So the plantations, the area where the Combee raid took place, I would say 85% of it is private property. And at the generosity of the current owners, I had access to where the raid took place. But it wasn't lost to me that the average person would never see this landscape. So I partnered with a photographer by the name of J. Henry Fair. Henry is an environmental and a conservation photographer who is he's very well known. And he's also a climate change activist. And he, grew up on the Combee. So Henry had been photographing this landscape for decades. And he offered to allow me to use photographs in his portfolio, but also to take photographs of additional locations that I wanted. And so we tried to capture specific sites that were significant to the Combee River Raid. So for example, first of all, there are plenty of shots of the river and the river from different angles, and the river where you can see the rice fields on one side and the marsh on the other. We also have shots of Combee Ferry, which is where the raid ends. But there were specific things like the creek that I mentioned that the boat came up. So we had to get a shot of the creek. And the planter, he wasn't the owner, but another story, who was on that particular plantation, who was awakened. I write about a letter he wrote to the editor in which he says he was awakened at 5 a.m. by his enslaved driver, telling him that the boat is coming up the creek to his boat landing. So he runs out to the portico to look and see the U.S. boats. And so I wanted that view that Joshua Nichols was his name, would have seen from his portico as the boats are coming up. As I mentioned, the plantations are private property, and so people would not get to see what Joshua Nichols saw. So we attempted to capture it. And Henry, he works primarily in aerial photography. That's where he sort of made his name, photographing toxic waste and things like that. But also drone and terrestrial photographs that he took.
I want to come back to Harriet Tubman because she did guide these gunboats, and a lot has been written about Harriet Tubman. What sort of new or additional insights about Tubman does this book provide?
Interestingly enough, and it's not surprising, that Tubman's role in the Combahee River Raid and really Tubman's Civil War service is not documented in the military record. We know from letters by Colonel James Montgomery, General Saxton, that Tubman was a spy and a scout for the U.S. Army, as well as a nurse. I was able to uncover new evidence, number one, about her intelligence gathering in the refugee camps. And I gathered much of this evidence in letters and journals by abolitionists who were down in Beaufort and Port Royal. So George Garrison, who was the son of William Lloyd Garrison, wrote a letter home talking about Harriet Tubman interviewing freedom seekers when they came from behind Confederate lines. He says that she made it her business to talk to all of them, and she got more intelligence than anyone. Lewis Douglas, who is the son of Frederick Douglass, wrote a letter to his fiancée a few days after the raid, where he says that Tubman was the captain of this group of spies, scouts, and pilots, and her men led Colonel Montgomery up the Combee River on Montgomery's most successful expedition. And lastly, there are letters written by Tubman's nephew, Harkless Bowley, and they're written to one of Tubman's biographers, Earl Conrad. And he talks about Tubman and her men finding the men who mined, the enslaved men who were forced to mine the Combee River with torpedoes. Now, right here, this is new because Civil War historians have denied Tubman's involvement. They've denied that there were torpedoes on the Combee River. Harkless continues that Tubman and her men took the enslaved men back to the site, oversaw the removal of the torpedoes, and opened the Combee River to the U.S. Army boats. And then he, as well as a teacher from Massachusetts, who wrote a letter, they talk about Tubman's role on the plantations, how during the Combee River Raid, she went onto the plantations and encouraged the people to come off and to come with the U.S. Army. So this was new evidence. I should say I also found a report from the U.S. Army Provost Marshal, which confirms this is about an enslaved man from one of the Combee plantations. And I had tracked his family already, so I knew who he was. He was the father of one of the freedom seekers I had already written about. He escaped from this plantation, which was raided, but he escaped a week before. And he gave intelligence to the U.S. Army Provost Marshal about the torpedoes. He describes the torpedoes. And I had some close consultations with Civil War experts from the Lowcountry. And I was trying to transcribe this document, and this phrase was very important. and I couldn't read it. The phrase where he's describing the torpedoes. So I said, let me send it to Stephen Weiss and see what he thinks. And boom, he sent me a picture of a potbelly stove, which is how the man described how large the torpedoes were and how they were shaped. So once we found that smoking gun, once I found the smoking gun, there's no more skepticism about whether or not the Combahee River was actually mined with torpedoes. And Tubman and her men removed them, had them removed, oversaw their removal, and opened up the river for the raid.
Well, you did so much research for this book, and one of the things you were able to confirm is that you have a personal connection to this raid.
Yes, I do. My third great-grandfather, Hector Fields, and this was a happy accident of research. I used the pension files of the men, the Combee men, the 150 men who liberated themselves in the raid and joined the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. That became the way that I was able to tell the story of the raid from the freedom seekers' perspective. I also got a chance to dig into the pension files of the 300 men who fought in the raid and was able to find my ancestors. I was able to find my ancestor. We didn't know a lot about Hector Fields before I began this project. And so I was able to learn more about him and able to fill in the gaps in our family tree in some very wonderful ways. And finding him, and we actually found him in his brother's pension file. And I was able to do this genealogical work through a partnership with the International African American Museum Center for Family History in Charleston. So we found Hector through his brother Jonas Fields' pension file. And from there, I learned about my fourth great-grandparents, great-great-great-great-grandparents, their sister, and where they were enslaved. And mind you, we knew none of this except we knew Hector and his direct descendants down to my grandfather. So now we have his siblings, we have their parents, we know where the family is from. And there were other people in the pension file who testified that they had grown up with Jonas Fields. And they had been enslaved on the same plantation as Jonas and his parents. So now I have the beginnings of an enslaved community. And it was really finding this information about my ancestor, which gave me the idea of trying to reconstruct the Combee community and reconstruct from the pension files of the men who escaped in the raid and then enlisted, reconstructing this Combee community.
There are many stories in here, and obviously much more that we don't have time to talk about. What would you say are some of the key concepts or key ideas that you hope that readers will take from learning about this event in history?
I hope that readers will gain a much better understanding, first of all, of the humanity of enslaved people. I want them to see enslaved people as husbands and wives and fathers and mothers and children and grandparents and aunties and uncles and cousins and lovers and all of the ways that people express themselves. I want them to hear the voices of the enslaved in ways that historians have not been able to access from the records of plantation owners. And if you listen to the voices, what you hear is that enslaved people wanted to be free. And what we see is that someone like Harriet Tubman, who was herself born and enslaved, right, and grew up enslaved and then liberates herself, as well as the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, and that includes the 150 men from the Combee, that they were willing to risk their lives, that they were willing to risk their freedom, and to many of them being re-enslaved was a fate worse than death, that they were willing to risk it all so that they and other people could be free. And they're a drop in the bucket of the 500,000 enslaved people who liberated themselves, seized their freedom, and went to U.S. occupied territory during the Civil War. And it's the actions and the agencies of these people that made the end of slavery inevitable.
Well, to learn more, the book is Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War. It's by Edda Fields-Black. Edda, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
If you'd like to purchase Combee, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and authors on a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.